On April 2nd, the Cuban government released 2,010 prisoners from its jails. This marks the second time this year the government has announced a prisoner release. The move comes amid a severe fuel and electricity shortage crisis, while the government is also negotiating with the U.S. Cuban state media described the release as a humanitarian and sovereign measure. They claimed the decision was based on a careful analysis of the crimes committed by the convicted, their good behavior in prison, the time they have already served, and their health status. This is one of the largest amnesties in recent years. Many people believe the timing of the release is a result of pressure from the U.S. Just a day earlier, Cuba's top diplomat in Washington publicly invited the U.S. government to help Cuba revive its struggling economy. This invitation is part of ongoing negotiations, but no results have emerged so far. Cuba is currently facing frequent power outages and fuel shortages, a situation worsened by U.S. sanctions. As a result, many people have taken to the streets to protest. Some even gathered outside government buildings, throwing out items to burn and destroy as a form of protest. It is unclear how many of the released prisoners were imprisoned for common crimes or charges related to anti-government protests. Earlier in March, the Cuban government claimed it had released 51 prisoners as part of an agreement with the Vatican, but the specific names were not disclosed. Human rights organizations have pointed out that the Cuban communist regime is still holding hundreds of political prisoners, though the estimates of the exact number vary. Additionally, after a deadly shootout between Cuban soldiers and 10 people on a Florida-registered speedboat in Cuban waters on February 25th, an FBI technical team arrived in Cuba on April 1st to conduct an independent investigation. In March, the Cuban government officially approved the FBI's entry into Cuba. Many people believe the investigation is a concession made by the Cuban government in response to the domestic crisis it is facing. 73 years ago, before Fidel and Raul Castro's communist revolution, Cuba was known as the Pearl of the Caribbean, much like Hong Kong was called the Pearl of the East, before its takeover by the Chinese Communist Party. After the Venezuelan strongman and close ally of the Cuban Communist Party, Nicolás Maduro, was captured by U.S. forces, Cuba's current First Secretary, Miguel Díaz-Canel, still claimed to firmly uphold the nation's sovereignty and independence. Despite the long-standing U.S. blockade, Cuba will continue on the socialist path, refusing to compromise. But when Cuba faced an energy crisis, plunging the country into darkness, the Communist Party was helpless. The people rose up in protest, angrily burning down the party office in Morón. The Cuban communist regime wavered, and Díaz-Canel was forced to back down, announcing reforms and opening the door to change. After Díaz-Canel's retreat, people in Havana and Cuban Americans in Florida took to the streets, singing and dancing, and hoping for the fall of the Communist Party. Florida, at the southernmost tip of the U.S., is only 90 miles from Cuba. For decades, more than 2 million Cubans have fled to Florida to escape communist persecution, including many business and political elites. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is of Cuban descent. Now, Rubio is holding secret talks with Guillermo Castro, the grandson of former Cuban president and Communist Party reformist Raul Castro. Díaz-Canel's recent signs of weakness toward the U.S. reveal clues about the direction of the secret talks between Guillermo and Rubio. The future of Cuba is about to change. On the eve of Cuba's transformation, Cubans online elected their preferred candidate for president. Selena Lambert Ortega, a 24-year-old woman from Cuba's second-largest city, Santiago, launched a poll on Facebook on January 12th, asking her fellow citizens to choose who they thought would be Cuba's next president. Within hours, Ortega's post went viral. Among the responses, an overwhelming majority voted for U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, the son of Cuban-American immigrants. Soon after, national security officers in Santiago summoned Ortega and ordered her to delete the post. Before it was deleted, Rubio had received around 35,000 votes, while Cuba's current president, Miguel Díaz-Canel, had only 475 votes. According to radio host Ninosca Perez Castellon, a well-known figure in Florida's Cuban exile community, what began as a simple post on social media quickly became a vivid snapshot reflecting current public sentiment. Recently, Perez Castellon visited the U.S. State Department and showed Secretary of State Marco Rubio the Facebook poll. She recalled that Rubio laughed at the time and jokingly said he didn't want to work overtime anymore. Rubio, who is currently leading U.S. negotiations with the Cuban regime, has clearly stated the U.S. position. On March 17th, he told Reuters that Cuba must thoroughly reform its political system, pointing out that the current leadership is incapable of solving Cuba's fragile economy. On March 27th, after attending the G7 foreign ministers meeting in Paris, Rubio reiterated to reporters that Cuba needs a change of regime, or the economy won't improve. He also added that the power shortage was due to Cuba's outdated infrastructure. It's not just the general public. A Cuban exile with a unique background recently spoke out as well. According to the Epoch Times, Elena Fernandez Revuelta, the daughter of former Cuban dictator Fidel Castro, strongly criticized the communist regime her father established in 1959, stating that Cuba should have had a new government long ago. Born in 1956, Fernandez grew up in Havana after the Cuban Revolution, part of the privileged revolutionary elite. However, she realized the reality of communism at a young age. Later, she became one of the most outspoken critics of her father's oppressive rule. In 1993, at the age of 37, Fernandez fled Havana and settled in Miami, where she lived a simple life like other Cuban exiles. In a March 30th interview, Fernandez said that in her view, Cuba should have undergone a regime change since the late 1980s. However, she pointed out that meaningful change is unlikely to happen within Cuba anytime soon. She stated that protests during power outages, such as banging on pots and pans, are not enough to overthrow the current regime. She explained that the communist system is still deeply entrenched, with power tightly concentrated, and many of the original leaders remain in power, even though some have passed away. However, if the current leadership of Cuba does not change, the U.S. may push strongly for the country to follow the trend toward freedom. On March 27th, U.S. President Donald Trump stated that Cuba could be the next target after Venezuela and Iran. He later humorously asked the media to pretend he didn't say that, but his statement sparked international attention. Earlier in March, Trump had mentioned that Cuba might face a friendly takeover, but then added, maybe not a friendly takeover. Regardless, Cuba is on the brink of major change. Meanwhile, its former big brother, Red China, continues to race down the path of communism. In recent years, Chinese authorities have continued tightening controls on citizens' ability to travel abroad. The scope of this control has expanded gradually, from senior Communist Party and government officials to managers in state-owned enterprises and public institutions. This passport confiscation system, based on pre-approval centralized collection and allocation based on need, signifies that the freedom of movement for individuals within the system has now been fully incorporated into political scrutiny. As we enter 2026, the barriers for Chinese citizens to travel abroad were raised even further, expanding from those within the communist system to those outside it. In January, the restrictions were clearly extended to retired officials and civil servants. By March, the measures had spread to ordinary citizens in certain provinces. In Wugang, Henan, residents found that obtaining a passport now requires submitting a variety of materials and receiving approval from 5 different departments. Some people stated that the process was so complicated it was practically impossible, forcing them to give up their applications. Documents show that the exit application review now involves many aspects, such as financial matters, communications, and social relationships. A form with 5 individual stamps from village, town, police stations, public security, and the anti-fraud office reveals how the Communist Party's control over citizens' travel has evolved from a traditional administrative service to an all-encompassing political review mechanism. A woman at the passport office helplessly said, "It's just too difficult to get a passport. The materials required are so many that it's impossible to gather them all. It's just a disguised way of preventing people from leaving the country." A scholar from mainland China stated that in the context of increasing social tensions and random acts of violence, the communist authorities are preventing so-called hostile forces from colluding both inside and outside the country. It is restricting citizens from leaving and preventing foreigners from entering. In the government's words, this is to eliminate security risks. In reality, it has gone far beyond conventional security measures and is using big data to impose pre-crime restrictions on citizens' activities. The communist government usually justifies these policies under the guise of combating telecom fraud. However, many public policy scholars point out that fighting fraud is just a surface-level reason, and that the core of the policy lies in tightening the flow of capital and people in the context of economic slowdown. This increasingly stringent approval system is pushing Chinese society toward a form of de facto house arrest for the entire population. Meanwhile, within China, the authorities have recently deployed large-scale identity control systems based on big data and facial recognition in public spaces. These systems directly link ID card information with biometric data, making it nearly impossible for individuals to avoid. A tourist from outside Beijing, who recently visited the city, shared a video on WeChat. They said, "I went through security checks 6 times in 5 days and scanned my ID card 15 times. I basically had to scan it everywhere I went. There were verification steps at scenic entrances, subway transfer points, and some public spaces, causing multiple interruptions to my journey." Some netizens criticized, "It's no longer a normal society when you have to scan your ID everywhere you go." Others said, "This frequency feels more like screening people rather than checking security." The Chinese Communist Party continues to tighten its control over online speech. Recently, authorities in Ezhou and Xiaogan, Hubei province, launched surprise crackdowns on ordinary internet users who were using VPNs. Police not only raided homes and conducted searches, but also publicly disclosed the fines, attempting to use terror tactics to further block the spread of truth. These actions have sparked public outrage. According to records from the Hubei Public Security Enforcement Platform, on March 11th, a man named Xu in Ezhou was punished by the Public Security Bureau for using a Huawei Honor phone to install the Clash VPN software and browsing overseas platforms like TikTok and X, which are blocked by the Chinese government. The crackdown in Xiaogan was even more violent. On the same day, over 10 police officers from a local station launched a coordinated action on a residential property, treating it as if they were handling a major criminal case. Under the immense pressure of the CCP state machinery, there is a growing sense of discontent among the people. Chinese entrepreneur Shen Qijia, who was illegally detained by the Chinese government, had over 4 million yuan in assets seized. Shen recently released a video condemning the party for banning his live streams. In a media interview, Shen described seeing fellow petitioners on their long journey for justice. Some were elderly, in their 70s or 80s, and their problems had been unresolved for years. Others had lost everything and had nowhere to turn. He said, "The Communist Party spends a huge amount of money to buy praise from others, but behind closed doors, they oppress the people and commit heinous crimes against them." Shen continued, "The people have no trust in the Communist Party, but they're afraid because the regime has a violent suppression system. We're like ants, insignificant in front of them, and we don't even know how we die. They sell human organs, and the people have no sense of security. So our evaluation of them is negative. They're illegal. They never went through an election by the people." He said that even if the Communist Party claims that the previous generation chose it, it was because they were deceived by the party. He said, "Now we all have 1 vote each. Do you have the courage to let people decide? You don't. I don't recognize you." Chinese scholar Yuan Hongbing, who has sought asylum in Australia, believes that beneath the apparent power and stability of the rulers lies a significant political crisis. The greatest crisis facing Xi Jinping is that he has almost offended every social class in China. Yuan Hongbing said that the government has not only cracked down on private entrepreneurs, but also implemented concentration camp-like lockdowns during the pandemic, alienating ordinary people. Xi Jinping relies on a high-tech armed intelligence system to conduct full surveillance on Communist Party officials. Even those officials who flatter him harbor hatred in their hearts. He said that under the iron-fisted rule, from ordinary citizens to Communist Party officials, people have only been able to hide their hatred for now. He said this hatred is accumulating every second, like underground fire spreading. In China, people are resisting the authorities in various ways. Yu Kai, the head of Shandong Xiaolin law firm, has publicly advocated for judicial reforms. He was punished and had his business suspended after suggesting that the Chinese People's Congress abolish the charge of picking quarrels and provoking trouble. On March 26, Yu Kai protested in front of the Ministry of Justice, but he was criminally detained by the police, ironically under the charge of picking quarrels and provoking trouble. From March 27th to the 31st, a Beijing resident questioned the authorities' forced demolitions and asked if they had a certificate, stating that they needed to confirm with the Housing and Urban Rural Development Bureau if the area was scheduled for demolition. The resident told security guards, "The next house you're demolishing is ours, right? If it's ours, I will fight to the death." A security guard then warned the resident not to record. The resident replied, "Don't remind me. I have the right to record. This is a citizen's right." However, on March 29th, an incident occurred in Beijing's Dahanji district, causing casualties. Witnesses revealed that the driver of the end loader, who had been petitioning in Beijing with no resolution, retaliated by attacking society. After the incident, the authorities blocked related information. This event was just one of many indiscriminate attacks that have occurred recently. China expert Yue Shan fled China 10 years ago. He stated that a change in China may be harder than a change in Cuba. It's not because the current system is too entrenched, but because of the mindset of the people. Yue Shan explained that the Chinese Communist Party's brainwashing over the decades has been particularly insidious. Through deception and violent intimidation, the party has trained a large proportion of the population to automatically comply, and even to defend the communist regime. Many people, when wronged, don't seek justice from the government, but instead direct their hatred toward innocent citizens, which he sees as cowardly behavior. He believes that if enough Chinese people realize that the Communist Party is the true culprit, and if they shift from a mindset of mutual harm to one of rebellion, only then will the country be able to change.